everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Jackie.
Hey, it's Anna.
Oh boy, guys. So we're here, we're talking about behavior analysis, behavior analytic research. You know, we do it every week. It's something we enjoy doing. It's a lot of fun. And, you know, we're getting close to our 200th episode. We've been doing this podcast for, I think like 6 years at this point. So I was taking a trip down memory lane. You know, I was revisiting some of our older episodes. I was thinking all about token economies. And I know we sort of talked about token economies. Dinah, what number was that?
176.
176. And we had a lot of fun. We talked about, strip mining, our favorite topic. That's not behavior analysis. We talked about school token economies.
The prison system.
Token economies in the prison system. But you know what we didn't really talk about? How token economies work. It was sort of a given, like, look, here they are, token economies. You can use them. You can do what you like with them. And then that's it. Maybe they'll work. Maybe they won't. And I believe we even said somewhere in that episode, like, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty. But you know what? I think it's about time. I think it's about time to get into the nitty gritty of how token economies work.
Dive into a big bucket full of stickers.
Or poker chips.
Yep.
Or whatever they might be.
This is your perfect time to use a Scrooge McDuck.
Oh, yeah, your big bag, your money bin of coins.
There you go.
That's true.
All right.
But unfortunately, when it comes time to talk about the nitty-gritty of token economies, we all felt like that was a little scary. So we said, you know what? We have a friend, a colleague. It's been we've known him for a long time. He knows all about this stuff. We got to get him on the show. And luckily, he said, all right, fine, I'll do it. And he's here tonight with us, Dr. Jason Bourret. Jason, thank you so much for coming on to get us under the hood of the token economy mystery. Not a mystery, I suppose, because there's research about it, but...
Right. It's all mystery until you dive in, right?
Yeah.
Mysteries are good, and then we solve the problems. Look, hi everybody. It's nice to see you.
It's very good to have you, Jason. So, Jason, we've known you for a long time, but some of our audience members may know you, some of them might not. Would you mind giving us a little bit of your background and sort of your interest in the topic?
Sure. So, gosh, I guess like a lot of people, I fell into behavior analysis on accident. I ended up going to the University of Florida for college. And initially, I wasn't even sure that I was going to go. I had a position working construction and like a foreman lined up, a foreman spot for me. So I was initially planning on doing that. And kind of on a whim, I ended up in college. And UF is such a big school. There were 40,000 undergrads at the time that I was there.
Wow.
And I knew that I wanted to pay rent. Like I knew that I would need food money, but I wasn't sure career-wise what I wanted to do. I started out, here's one of the things I enjoyed about a big school. You could take all kinds of stuff. And so I'm taking classes and things that interested me. And I ended up being a philosophy major for a while. You find yourself in philosophy classes with these incommensurable positions that people take. So they're not speaking the same language and there's no standard for agreement. And that's makes for just annoying conversations. And I ended up gravitating more toward empirical sciences. So the beauty there being you can check with nature, and that's your arbiter to decide who's right and who's wrong. And it just turned out that the behavior analysis department in psychology at UF was phenomenal. And it became readily apparent to me that amongst the myriad of positions in psychology about why people do things, these folks were right, and they could show me the data to back it up. So this is sort of how I fell into behavior analysis. For me in that experience, I volunteered in Tim Hackenberg's Pigeon Lab, and he had set up the operant chambers so that there was the intelligence panel, the front panel that the pigeons are looking at with keys in it. He had set up a row of LEDs along the top, and that allowed him to essentially have the pigeons responding, produce those LEDs being lit. The pigeons would then earn lit LEDs and then would exchange them one by one for food. So Hack had set up essentially a preparation that allowed the study of conditioned and token reinforcement in pigeons. So that was unique, and it set them up to ask a number of important research questions. It's obviously not the first arrangement in non-humans regarding token economies and conditioned reinforcement, but it did allow them to use the pigeon manipulanda and get everything set up for the pigeons that they had. Other research had involved chimps and rats and actual manipulables, so this was a little bit different. And those were some seminal experiences for me. Some of my introduction to behavior analysis was sitting in those lab meetings and hearing Hack talk about what's going on, how, in what ways are these lights controlling the behavior of the pigeons, and helping. You guys know how science works. The act of doing a study never is as clean as what you see in the terminal manuscript that gets
So
published.
true.
So,
Oh no.
Sadly.
yeah. Well, so just sitting in there and doing the problem solving, and what do we do when the pigeons don't attend to them, and what do we, this pigeon's not looking at the lights, and how would we get them to, and how do we demonstrate that these things actually are functioning as reinforcers? There are all these questions you have to ask yourself before you can even get to the study proper. So anyway, that for me was an introduction to the concept of condition reinforcement. I ended up being one of Tim Ballmer's graduate students and finishing up my degree at UF. And I had, ever since then, my career has been at the New England Center for Children. I'm the clinical director there right now. So I've had a clinical job, and I've been fortunate to, on the side, kind of as a hobby, continue to pursue research and have a lab and publish some of the work that we do. And we've always had a line of research on condition reinforcement. It's an area that is ripe for additional research. For people that are listening, if you get a chance, Hack's got a couple excellent reviews on condition reinforcement. The 2018 paper ties into applied work. And one of the things that he talks about is there's the lines of research that you see in Java and in JAB are largely divergent. So there isn't a tremendous amount of communication between the two. Mm-hmm. The research that has been clinically oriented has largely been, posture has been toward solving a problem, which obviously that's part of what you have to do. But the basic research has been more directed toward identifying stimulus functions that are exerted by these stimuli and trying to investigate particularly what processes are at play. And so what it means is that for somebody who's familiar with that research, there's a whole realm of translational work to be done that can bridge those two areas. So that's sort of how I landed here, and why it's been an interest of mine throughout my career.
Excellent. Well, we've got two articles that we'll be discussing tonight, and one certainly that you worked on with your students. And that is a comparison of token and tandem schedules of reinforcement on response patterns for adolescents with autism by Glodowski, Bourret, Ivy, Seaver, Jackson, Stine, and Nuzzolilli from Behavioral Interventions 2020. And then kind of his background, I think we're going to have to talk about it because it's probably captures some of the divergence that you mentioned, Jason, but responding under chained and tandem fixed ratio schedules by Jwaideh from the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, 1973.
Yeah, that Jwaideh study is really cool. So it's one of the earlier studies in this area, and so I think that's absolutely what we're talking about as an introduction to an investigation of what stimuli that are associated with the components of a chain schedule, what those stimuli do to behavior.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with a little bit of, general background information. I mean, maybe a little bit about the history of token reinforcement, and then what are some of the big terms that we're going to be using consistently, make sure everyone's up to date. They've brushed up their glossary, what's conditioned reinforcement, make sure they're really solid there. Because it does sort of seem like token reinforcement is one of those pieces that started in the research a long, long time ago, the applied research, and then just sort of was taken as gospel of, yep, token reinforcement. Everyone loves token economies. We'll all use them forever. Don't worry much more about it. And, we sort of moved on. Jason, do you mind adding a little bit more detail into my very, very glib and short summary there?
No, that was great. I mean, you can go back to Wolf 36, Cowles 37 for research on tokens. So, and those are with chimps. So people have been researching these things for a very long time. And then you've got the Aon and Azrin 65 as sort of an introduction to this line of research for people that are doing applied work. Comes out even before Java, so you can see how early this is happening. I would like to sort of zoom out and talk about what we mean by the concept of condition reinforcement and how condition reinforcers come about, how we tell if we've got one and how they're generated. So you have there are unconditioned reinforcers. So these are phylogenetically selected. So these we are born with a sensitivity to these events as reinforcers, and there are some of these. But one of the things that you'll notice about, say, an infant is that babies are not good at a lot of things. So they're not good conversationalists. They don't drive well. There's a lot of things that they don't do yet. And we have a tendency to think about that, meaning the repertoire is not yet developed. So they've got their sensitivity to unconditional reinforcement, but the ontogenically selected repertoire has not been established yet. So, and this is true. This is true. So they have not yet gained the repertoire that they will later in life. Another thing that I think is important to realize is that many of the stimulus functions that are and have been established for somebody who's an adult human being have not yet been established in babies. So what that means, and they have to be established. So they are established within our lifetime. So things like these can be really general things that happen to us so often and that control our behavior so easily that we become blind to them. So things like if you pick something up and move it closer to you in your visual space, this thing gets larger, right? So that's so things like the feel of something when you have it in your hand, you've grabbed it and you pick it up. These sorts of stimuli can come to act as condition reinforcers, and they can underlie a tremendous amount of the building of the repertoires that we develop over the course of our lifetime. So we aren't just talking about things like money or things like tokens or things like praise. We're talking about the stimuli that exist within our stream of experience all the time. So there's some, I need to look this up. I'm gonna talk about things that probably may not exist, but I remember hearing about an app that you would say something and it would replay your voice back to you at a delay. And so instead of hearing yourself speak as you're speaking, you would hear yourself speak slightly later. And that throws you all kinds of off when that sort of thing happens. Or imagine you ever do the thing like you put your head down on a baseball bat and spin around like 900 times, then you try to walk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the proprioceptive stimulation that you're used to feeling is different now. And though all of a sudden the walking becomes nearly impossible. So I just point that out because so much of what we do relies upon condition reinforcement, experiencing stimuli that have acquired stimulus functions with regard to our repertoires. And it's, this will underlie learning that happens as examples of automatic reinforcement. I teach a course in verbal behavior, and one of the things that I think is interesting are questions like, how do you learn when you study by yourself using flashcards? And here's why I bring that up. It's like you're used to saying learning, well, there's reinforcement. So the flashcard, it's like you're establishing this interverbal, and we reinforce the occurrence of the response given the antecedent stimulus. All right, fine. But you can learn by yourself with flashcards, right? So who's doing the reinforcement? And you don't want to get into, there's this old Catania paper from this defunct journal called Behaviorism. So I want to say it's like 1976 or 78, but it's about the notion of self-reinforcement because, then I reinforcement. Well, that's not a real contingency. So there is no such thing in that sense as self-reinforcement. But there is the fact that things like parity between heard stimuli and the products of our responses can come to function as condition reinforcement. So when you read the question on one side, you flip it over, you emit a textual, you read the answer on the back, and then you say it yourself over and over and over. And then you practice again. You look at the front of the flashcard, you flip it over, you close your eyes, you don't look, you say it, and then you look, and then you emit the textual again. And when there's parity between the response that is initially coming under the control of the one side of the flashcard and the stimuli produced by your textual, that will act as condition reinforcement. Well, that's a learned stimulus function, the parity between those stimuli. And we all use flashcards. We do this sort of thing all the time. We learn things, we read, and we practice speaking. Well, all of that works because of the development of condition reinforcement regarding these sorts of stimulus functions. Again, to go sort of broad, condition reinforcement is ubiquitous. It happens all of the time. I want to talk for a minute about the way that condition reinforcers are generated. If you look like in the Cooper book, or there are many places where you will find a description of the operation that results in the development of condition reinforcement. If you talk to BCBAs, I'm sure that they will say that you pair the stimuli. You pair a neutral stimulus with a condition reinforcer, and then the neutral stimulus becomes or you pair the neutral stimulus with an unconditioned reinforcer. Then the neutral stimulus comes to serve as a conditioned reinforcer. So it's an application of the responding conditioning paradigm. Well, okay. So it's like, that paradigm is unconditioned stimulus paired with the neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus comes to elicit a conditioned response, which often is similar topographically to the unconditioned response. It's elicited by the unconditioned stimulus, blah, blah, blah. Right? Well, thing about that is that is with regard to respondent behavior. If we are saying what is our defining feature for a condition reinforcer? Is it that it elicits a condition response? Is that what our defining feature is? Well, it's not. The defining feature for a condition reinforcer is that some previously neutral stimulus now, when delivered contingent on a response, increases the probability of that response. That's an operant effect. It's not a respondent effect. I'm not sure that we have that right. So there's a competing account that I think is correct about the operation that results in the development of a condition reinforcer. And there are a couple studies, like you can go back to Dinsmore in 1950. This was his dissertation, or Per-Holth has some great research on this. There's a Holth et al. 2009. That's a really good paper that's worth looking at. But the competing interpretation is that to establish something as a condition reinforcer, you establish it as discriminative for the availability of some subsequent unconditioned reinforcer. So this is like, for the old folks out there, this is like Michael's blocked response CEO. So if we go all the way back to 82, or the 93 paper on conditioned establishing operations, this is the transitive condition establishing operation. That if there are a chain of stimuli such that the acquisition of a terminal reinforcer requires movement through the chain, that will establish the EO, the unconditioned EO that establishes the terminal reinforcer as reinforcing, will also establish as reinforcing all the stimuli that are needed to produce that terminal reinforcer. That's sort of interesting, because that's what a token economy is like. You need, if your token board has 10 tokens on it, you got to have 10 tokens before you're going to get the edible. When the edible is established as reinforcing, you like the client, the student, to start looking for tokens, right? You'd like that to evoke behavior that has characteristically produced tokens. You'd like the kid to say, like, hey, can I do some work? Because I would really like to get that snack later. So that there's a TCEO account for the establishment of condition reinforcers that I find it to be pretty compelling. And so you've got a couple studies. There's this Holth et al. 2009 paper in which they directly compared stimulus-stimulus pairing to establishing stimuli as discriminative for the availability of reinforcement in terms of what sort of effect they're going to get when they deliver these stimuli contingent on responding separately. And it's such a good study. It's a bunch of arbitrary stimuli. They check them all first to make sure they don't act as reinforcers. Some of them, they just do pairing. Separately, they have a group of stimuli for which the presence of the stimulus signals the availability of reinforcement for some response. Turns out the arrangement of those stimuli, establishing them as discriminative stimuli, was far more effective than was the stimulus-stimulus pairing. There's a Dozier et al. Paper 2012 trying to establish praise as a condition reinforcer. And they did a million, it's not a million. They did it, but like metaphorically, a million trials of pairing, right? Didn't work. And then they embedded the stimulus in a contingency. So, and that resulted in the stimuli coming to function as condition reinforcers. So, I find it to be pretty compelling that when we are creating condition reinforcers, what we're doing is establishing some stimulus is necessary for the subsequent production of some already established reinforcement. And think about the Scrooge McDuck thing, right? You don't do that. You don't you don't take all your money out of a bank and put it into a container and swim in it, right? You don't.
Well, I do.
You don't.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm speaking for myself, I guess.
Okay, fair enough.
Like, imagine you need to go to work and you go to your car, what are you going to need to drive your car? You're going to need your keys, right? Yeah.
Big bag of money.
Well, you get another car, but you're gonna need the keys, and it evokes key finding behavior. So then you engage. I don't know about you, but I put my keys in the same spot every time, just for this reason. So that way, that response can be evoked and be successful. And once I've got my keys and I get to the place that I'm going, I put them in my pocket, and I don't do anything with them again until I need to drive my car. I don't hold them. I don't hug them. They have not, like, the reinforcing effects have not rubbed off onto them. It's not like some property of the stimulus. They're not imbued with that. I don't just love and hug on my keys all the time.
I wish you did, though.
I love this.
Yeah, it'd be weird if I did, but I don't. And so, when to me that's pretty convincing. That
Mhm.
when we're talking about condition reinforcers, we're talking about the action of transitive condition establishing operations and embedding stimuli within a chain, and thus having them come to serve as condition reinforcers.
I like that.
That is really,
I think that helps a lot. And, when I talk to my students about it and I ask them, like, have you ever just given your students tokens and said, okay, here's the system, you can earn 5 of these and then you get to trade in? And many of them say, yeah, that's exactly what I did. I just gave them the system. And they say, well, have you ever, taught them how to use the tokens, taught the system by teaching you trade in 1 and you get it, and then you increase it slowly. And many of them have not had that experience. So they're missing that piece of teaching the contingency.
Sure. You can test this, but you love the EO to evoke searching for tokens. You'd like the kid, when the kid is interested in working, to go and get the token board. Go,
Right.
Yeah. Or sneak an extra token on.
Sure. Yeah.
Yep.
And there's not.
Yeah.
We have a robust technology for assessing the efficacy, the strength, the value of unconditioned reinforcers. We do preference assessments.
Mhm.
So, but I've rarely run into folks who then apply a methodology to assessing whether the condition reinforcers are actually operating as condition reinforcers.
Jason, I think that kind of leads to another question in terms of the use of token economies or how token economies work. Because in thinking about condition reinforcers, how do condition reinforcers develop, I honestly don't think I've put that much thought into how that relates to the token economy. It's sort of just been one of those things that someone showed me how to use it. Seemed effective. I said, this looks great. Probably has something to do with condition reinforcers somewhere. I guess it's because everyone loves their tokens, and like with the keys, they're going to hug their tokens or whatever. And I'll go from there and never think about it more. I mean, why do you think that might be? It just doesn't seem like the why of the token economy is as popular a question as you think it would be, given just the ubiquity of the token board. I think especially in schools for autism or special education schools.
People all think they know the answer. So we've taught people an operation for that outcome. So we've taught people that it's stimulus pairing. And that's, again, it's in the Cooper book. I promise that's what you'll hear if you ask BCBAs, how do you do this?
That's probably what I would have said. Not anymore, though. Not anymore.
No.
I mean, of course, that's what, if there's some new area, I'm going to say the thing that I learned. I'm not going to, it's not like I instantaneously am going to know the new fact until I've had a chance to learn the new fact. But what it does is it acts as an abolishing operation for further investigation.
Right.
So if, you and I, we learn a lot from what we read and from what we see at conferences and from our conversations with our peers, but we don't do all those studies personally. And, so we're relying on those verbal constructions of functional relations. And that's what we learn. We learn them as intraverbals. Sometimes what can end up happening is, and this was sort of what the sense I get from reading Per Holt's work, he had tried what he thought was supposed to work and it wasn't working. And that's what you get also from that Dozier 2012 paper. She had tried what she thought was supposed to work and it wasn't working. So, now you've got an EO. So the rules that you were taught are not effective, which suggests that they might be wrong and that we'd want to look into that.
2009 was a big year for Per Holt because he also wrote one of my favorite joint attention papers that year.
He was rocking it that year.
All over the place.
Jealous.
So I think kind of in the same topic of sort of the big picture, talking about token economies, trying to get into more, why they work as conditioned reinforcers. What are the components of the working token economy? Because again, I think that's another question that before, kind of preparing for this article, I'd be like, oh, well, you need tokens, of course, and probably like a laminated board and, your SpongeBob stickers or whatever, and backup reinforcers. And that's all you need. Why? Just that's how I learned to do them. And that's fine. Yeah. But there's much more to it in terms of the schedules that are in play, sort of the ratios that are being used. Do you mind kind of going through some of the key terms that are going to come into play when we're discussing the economies?
Yeah. So there are a few, let me just lay out some concepts. So there are some related schedules that are good to understand because the research on them has relevance to discussions of condition reinforcement and token economies. So one is a chained schedule. So a chained schedule, that's a compound schedule composed of two or more schedules, wherein each component has a correlated stimulus, and completion of a response requirement in one component leads to the next until the entirety of the chain is complete, and then terminal reinforcement is delivered. So there are chain schedules. And I think you can probably see the relation between that and a token schedule. If you have a token board, it's sort of like the blank board is component 1, and then you've got one token on there, and now we're in component 2, and then you've got the next token, et cetera, et cetera. So research on chain schedules ties in. Token schedules sometimes are second order schedules. So like a second order thing is a thing of things. So a second order schedule is a schedule of schedules. So for example, if you had and the way that you'll see this written is like the higher order schedules on the outside, and then there's parentheses, and then the lower order schedules on the inside. So if you had if tokens were produced on a VR5 and then 10 tokens were needed for primary reinforcement, it would be an FR10 and then within parentheses VR5. So it's like an FR10 of VR5. So you got to do the VR5 thing 10 times, and then primary reinforcement happens. So token economies are often like that. It's very common that the token would be produced on an FR1 and that the exchange schedule would be some other FR value, 10. We got 10 fingers, 10 toes. We got a base 10 mathematical system. People tend to default to that value.
We love 10. Yeah.
It's the size of a laminate they let you use at the laminate machine when you're getting your pretty cardboard.
Yeah.
My son,
lots of reasons to go with that.
Yeah. My littlest kid has this in his kindergarten class, and they get little stickers, but they call it a 10 frame, and it's like 10 little squares, and they get something from the treasure pile. So it's all over the place.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't make it optimal, though, right?
No.
Like one of the things we've learned from behavioral economics is that the changes in the unit price will affect the likelihood of behavior. So if you have something that's really cheap, then you end up getting sort of like grazing over time.
Mm-hmm.
If you have something that's too expensive, well, you can get ratio strain. And so behavior can, in a molecular sense, start undergoing extinction. So that's something to pay attention to. Like what is it's called an exchange production schedule. So in other words, what do we need to make take place before an exchange occurs? And again, although there's a large literature base on assessing the value of primary reinforcers, nobody's generated a relatively efficient method for determining what's an optimal unit price, what's an optimal exchange schedule. We can't assume that we're just going to happen to pick it, right, when we pick arbitrarily.
I wish, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would be nice.
It is nice if you just happen across
magically chose
But it's not a one size fits all.
No.
thing.
Yeah, right. So there's an exchange production schedule. There's a token production schedule. That's the thing that you do, the response requirement for the production of a token. And these are manipulable, and it turns out they can matter. So you could have the token system doesn't need to require physical objects. You might have a condition reinforcement system wherein a student earns points, and the points are exchangeable from a menu of options. And you could set that up so that they can be exchanged at any time. So now there's no exchange production schedule. The exchange is always available in that case. There are some things to think about. So there are these elements of the schedules that are manipulable, that we can adjust. And there are some things to pay attention to. And this is something that we address in Catherine Glodowski's paper and that you see in the Jwaideh study. One of the things that we've observed in basic research is that at large ratio requirements, on a token schedule or a chain schedule, the early component links will suppress responding. So meaning, in basic research, when we have direct comparisons of chain schedules to tandem schedules, a tandem schedule it's identical to the chain, but without the stimulant. So it's the same number of responses to primary reinforcement. So if we compare chain and tandem schedules, well, the chain schedule produces lower response rates. If you compare token and tandem schedules, the token schedule produces lower response rates. Well, that's not really what you're looking for. That's indicating that the inclusion of the tokens is actually decreasing the likelihood of behavior. So the research on that suggests that what ends up happening is that the tokens, ideally they're operating as condition reinforcers, but responding on a token schedule is going to be a joint outcome of the effects of any condition reinforcers, the effects of the primary reinforcer, and any discriminative functions that have been established with regard to any components of the token schedule. So if your experience is, imagine there's a kid who's got to do like 10 trials during a token, and then there's 10 tokens to the exchange the tokens. What's 100 responses to get to the primary reinforcer? And so the kid's experience can be when the tokens have been exchanged and the blank board happens again, well, that signals that the next response will never, ever, ever result in reinforcement. The primary reinforcer is gone, and it's gone for a very long time. And that can establish that stimulus, the blank token board, as an S delta. You can get suppression of responding early on. It can end up like if the control by the token boards and the academic stimuli is absent, we can get the kid going off task or engaging in other behavior. Pigeons, when this happens, they'll like look away from the intelligence panel. Like it's like, oh, they don't want to see it.
Yeah.
It's like if you have a big paper to write and you go and you open up the blank Word document, you're like, oh man, I gotta clean my house now. And you go do all these other things.
Right.
Every time.
Yeah. Well, so this can happen with our kids putatively, right? So that this was our point with Catherine's paper to suss that out and see if we do is this something we need to worry about? Do we find it? It tends to happen at really high ratio requirements. So and you're talking like hundreds and hundreds of responses. So the Jwaideh paper is so great, and there are so many elements to that I really like. That they don't see these effects until they're up around like 240 responses to primary reinforcement. But at the lower schedules, they don't see it. And there are other research showing that. There's a Foster, Jwaideh, and Hackenberg 2001 paper that entailed a comparison of FR and VR exchange production schedules. Well, that's interesting because if we might be concerned about early component response suppression because the early components are differentially correlated with extinction, one way to address that is to make the exchange production schedule variable so that sometimes the early component is associated with reinforcement. Well, that can result in that component no longer functioning as an S delta. And they showed that. So they showed that under VR exchange production schedules, the suppressive effect that they got under the FR schedule goes away and the response rates lift up in those early components. Well, that's pretty cool, right? Nobody's ever done the applied version of that study, just a replication, that has reliably showed that. And they get these at just the larger schedule values. So they got them when they had, I want to say 8 tokens to exchange, but not when there were 4. And so again, the generality boundary here isn't entirely clear. It looks like larger ratio requirements whereby you'd expect the early components to really come to function as S deltas. That seems to, in my opinion anyway, is the critical variable with trying to get that effect, right? So you've got exchange schedule values. You can make them variable. You can make them fixed. They can be anything you want. You can do the same thing for the tokens. You can make them fixed. You can make it a variable schedule for token production. Anything that we know about basic, simple schedules of reinforcement also apply to token productions. So you think about it, what if on your cumulative record, the highest response rate that you get, the highest steady response rate is under a VR? Well, why not make your tokens on a VR then?
Yeah. Right.
And then do the exchange on a VR. And now it's operating more like Vegas. So this is like you're paying for tokens, and then the tokens at some point are going to cash in for you. But the way you run that economy is different. We're used to running economies like there's a board, there's 10. Once the kid gets 10, we exchange. On a VR exchange schedule, they're really more like you're putting money in a slot machine. Like every token might be the winner. And so you don't even need a board for that. It's more like, is this one the winner? Is this one the winner? You could have the student roll a die, like make it a 1 in 6. And so every time the kid gets a condition reinforcer, the kid rolls a die. So that's a way to try to make use of what we know about variable schedules as we're constructing a token economy. Rob, you're right about you got to have tokens or something, right? Like points, checks, something in there. Anything wherein you can signal movement through towards some already established reinforcers. So that's the way that I tend to think about it. I'm trying to make a chain. I'm trying to make a chain out of this. And so I want stimuli that are associated with movement through the chain. You might just have stimuli that are associated with the winning part of it, right? That's another way to try to alleviate the early component suppression. Like there's research on brief stimuli, like flashing the hopper, or praise, right? Like a stimulus that happens, but it isn't just correlated with the early component. That's what happens when primary reinforcement happens. So if it was the case that you're using praise as a reinforcer, I'd be interested in a study in which, we try to establish praise by making it discriminative for the availability of some reinforcer on a VR. Like it signals that you could be a winner now. And so, right. So that might But, I bet it would to establish praise as a reinforcer. There are some parts, I don't know if that helps. But
I think you went over a whole bevy of interesting.
Well, I'm gonna tell you what I think. So,
Go for it.
So I have this punch card for nothing bunt cakes, which are quite good.
Mhm.
But you got to order 10. You got to get 10 of them in order to get a free one. And I'm still stuck on number 3.
Mm.
And it just seems like so many more than I need to buy. But when I go to Panera, I have no idea where I am in the point system, right? And sometimes you give them your name and then they say, guess what? Today you earned enough for a free cookie, but I have no idea until I get up there. And I'm always so much more excited about it. I'm probably never going to get all those bun cakes.
But does that change the going to Panera or going to nothing bunt cakes?
I'm still on
drive-in
3.
response. I don't know.
I'm still on 3. Right? And I have no idea how I am on Panera, but I do like the cookie.
that's kind of like if anybody needs a thesis or dissertation, that's kind of a neat study. You could make it concurrent. So you could set people up with which one of these cards do you want? Do you want the VR card or do you want the FR card?
Yeah.
And just, yoke the mean of the VR. So it's about the same.
That would be
Delicious.
so fun.
That
I want to be the first participant.
Okay.
You can't write it and be a participant. I don't think.
You could, Jackie, you could do that for your class. You could set them up on like extra credit, something like that.
That'd be so much better than my failed delay discounting assignment.
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. It'd be interesting. I think that's publishable if you were to put it out there. So just which one do they pick? Would you rather have VR X credit or would you rather have FR X credit?
Cool.
I'll give you all the credit.
Good idea.
No, and it's
Let's take, now that we've kind of got a good sense of some background, some good directions, let's take a little break. We'll come back and get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of the study itself, how it was run and all that, and then some final thoughts. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
But before we get back into the discussion that we were having and the fun that we were having about token economies, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening to the show, then go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus, that's GET-CEUS, and enter in some information, including 2 code words we've put into this episode. And these are our guest code words from Dr. Bourret. The first is Michael. Michael, whether you're thinking of Dr. Jack Michael, who was such a big leader in our field, gave us so many of the terms we use today, certainly, motivating operations, establishing operations, all that, or whether you're thinking of the John Travolta 90s movie Michael, where he's an angel or whatever, whichever one you want to think about, code words Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L. All right, let's keep going with our conversation about token economies. And we are back talking with Dr. Jason Bourret about token economies, really getting under the hood, getting into the nitty gritty of how they work. And why don't we continue that? Jason, you had so many, great ideas already, but let's talk a little bit more about the study you did with Catherine Glodowski and your other group. The other group. Was this a study that she had in mind that you sort of recommended, that you felt like we need to look at the application of token economies a little more closely? Like, what was the genesis of that idea?
The reason why I had included the Jwaideh study is that study I find to be, the findings are not what you expect. So Essentially, it's this demonstration that the stimuli that we think of as condition reinforcers are actually suppressing responding. There were parts of it that I think are critical to think about. So as they added more components to the chain, they got greater suppression. And it took the pigeons longer to get through the response sequence, even if it was the same number of responses, just by adding more stimuli along the way. So if it's a total of, say, 180 responses, if it was 2 stimuli versus 3 versus 5, it took them the longest to do it when there were 5 stimuli. Well, there's no reason for that, right? Like that pigeon's not being logical, but it's indicating that there are stimulus functions forming. And to me, it made me wonder, how do we have this happen to us in clinical application? Are there situations in which we shoot ourselves in the foot by arranging a system that is designed to be condition reinforcement, but perhaps it's not? There are these good comparison for a token schedule or a chain schedule is a tandem schedule. So same primary reinforcement, same number of responses to get there, but it just doesn't have the stimuli. So if you want to know what do the stimuli do that are embedded along the way, then a tandem schedule is a good point of comparison. So there are a few elements to that study that I think are important. One is we had essentially a condition reinforcer assessment. So just like a reinforcer assessment, but with the token. So just to make sure that things are operating as condition reinforcers. And that I think is important, because if you don't know that the kid is even attending to them, honestly. Like it's hard to say that we're asking the question that we want to if they aren't acting as condition reinforcers. So we have that element to it. I think that's important.
So is that why you used students that already had token economies in their history?
Yeah, well, so this is a great question, whether or not you should do that for this type of research. So and to what degree we would expect that to matter. You're using novel stimuli in an attempt to establish those stimulus functions, right? Well, that being said, think again about our experiences with regard to the stimuli that we encounter all the time. If you have a kid for whom that kid has had a token economy with, say, like poker chips or something like that, right? Well, the kids experience being handed things, and then they get enough of those, and then primary reinforcement happens. And now we're not using poker chips, we're using like laminated cards, and we're handing them to the kid. There are some shared stimuli that are part of both of those schedules. So it could be just the receipt of the thing repetitively could already be acting as a condition reinforcer, right? So this is, gosh, I guess we can talk for a second about translational research and what we're doing. It's optimal to ask questions about processes with as few confounds as you possibly can, so that you can make clear conclusions about what exactly these operations are doing to behavior. Translational research is research in which there's typically an application of basic science methodology to attempt to clearly answer a question that has implications for clinical and educational application. So in translational research, it doesn't tend to produce a socially significant outcome in and of itself, but it could inform the schedule of reinforcement for that subject, for example, or the way in which we arrange reinforcers for that subject. It could be useful information to have for that subject. So this I view as an example of translational research. These are kids that use token economies. They're kids that they have a history of token economy. They're going to leave our sessions and go and experience a token economy. So there are reasons to know these things regarding the behavior of these kids. Like imagine you could do the study and you're using their regular IEP objectives or something like that. And then you've got like different tasks. Well, all of those end up being potentially confounds. Like, are all the tasks equal in difficulty? Do they know them equally well? Do they take the same amount of time to complete? So you sort of wonder, right? If the findings that you get are truly because of the manipulations that you made. So in this case, we have an example of translational research it'd be best if there was no stimulus function prior to us starting with these participants, and then we get it established, and then we're off and running.
That makes sense. Yeah. That was something when I read that, I'm like, I was actually quite surprised that you used kids with a history of token economies, because I thought you might establish the tokens first, like you yourselves, right? But that makes a lot of sense.
There's a good argument for doing that, and this is why it's hard for me to get anything published, because like the area you exist in when you do translational research is it's too too basic for Java and too applied for JEB.
Mhm.
You know,
It's
and then
muddy.
I even got, there's a translational research section in JEB, and I got, this is to apply for that even. So then like that's like some ground in there that you tend to land on. I don't know that I'm making the right decisions about that, but you have to, it's like, you know, a case history in the scientific method, what's that, 56, that Skinner paper? Some ways of doing research are easier than others is one of them. And so you're at this spot where you got to get a study done. You need to answer a question about nature. You have constraints. You can't have these participants in your study for 900 years.
Right.
You want it, ideally, it produces some useful outcome for them. So you land in an area in which you're making some choices, and maybe they're not the best, but you're doing your best, right? To try to make choices that allow you to have interpretable data, and at the same time, like pragmatically get the study done, and hopefully have some implications that are useful for somebody.
And then I think that also answers, I know I was sort of, not thinking about it in terms of transitional research, thinking about it like, well, target touching, who cares? That's not a skill anyone needs to know. Again, same idea. touch, back and forth.
So that's a good question. You'll have listeners who see that. And I've run into folks who are on the editorial board of Java, who that's their first response is, who cares about this? And the answer to that is, well, the clinicians for these kids do, because they want to know how to best arrange schedules for reinforcement. And, you know, the scientific community might, because you might learn something that the rest of us can then subsequently apply. And so it is purposefully designed to be a response that is constant across conditions so that our interpretation can be clean.
Because you don't care about the IEP objectives right here. That's not what you're looking for, right? You care about them, but ultimately later, when the token economy is working successfully in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. It's kind of like, why do an FA? Why not just try a bunch of different treatments? You know, and the reason why you do the FA is so that you get information that allows you then to subsequently be effective. And so it's the same sort of thing. You get good information about the reinforcement system that you put in place, and then that helps the kid for the whole rest of his educational career.
So, you know, you have the token touching, you have the kids with the adolescents with the condition reinforcers, you looked at the different schedules. And your results didn't exactly copy the Jwaideh study in terms of, you know, some participants, you did see those patterns, or you saw them at certain ratios. Did you have any expectations in doing the study of what you were going to see? Was that surprising in terms of like the overall result?
Yeah, I mean, we had different outcomes for different individuals. I think it's important to publish those when you get them. So it's easy enough to just take out the non-effect ones and then just publish the effect one. The problem that you run into is you don't have an understanding of why it is that there's difference, or that that there would be a generality boundary that you might need to suss out. You know, so I do think it's useful to publish those findings. When you get discrepant findings across participants, it's not because one of your participants is a weird mutant. It's because there's been a difference somewhere parametrically in what you've done for these participants, given their experience, their history, and their physiology and their sensitivity, what you've done. So, you know, like if you were doing a study, if it was a bee farm study, and there's a reason why you plot a dose response curve, because the individual doses might have different effects depending on the participant, but you get the same sort of function for when you've mapped it out across participants. So this is part of what we try to do in this study, is to do it parametrically in terms of trying to assess different schedule values. But there are a few things that you would need. So as we went into it, the thought was, are we going to get the same sort of findings that we've seen in basic research, where under certain circumstances, the inclusion of the tokens actually is decreasing the likelihood of behavior, right? So that's kind of what we're looking for. And we didn't reliably get in, but here's the circumstances under which you'd expect it would be when the early component links have been established as S deltas. That's when you would expect to get this. And so then you think about, what would the experience be of the participants that would result in that outcome? Well, they'd need pretty extensive experience with the stimuli associated with those early component links. They'd have to never have reinforcement during the presence of those stimuli. And you'd like it to be sufficiently distanced from the delivery of primary reinforcement, you know, such that they've got this pretty rigid experience with the arrangement of these stimuli. And they have to be attending to them, you know, like there are a number of things that have to take place. I talked to Chris Bullock about this a little bit. So Chris was one of Tim Hackenberg's students when I was in school. And he's a very bright guy, and he knows this research really well. And one of the things that Chris always emphasized was to make sure that the participants have to have to give you the tokens. Like they have to do something with them. They have to interact with them because that forces them to see them and to orient toward them and to reach for them and to pick them up. And so that in his argument was that that would be an experience that would be important in establishing the stimulus function, right? Mm-hmm. And so as I've done this sort of research and looked into it, there are a few things that I think about that might maximize the likelihood of you detecting this kind of effect. And so that would be one, to make sure that the participants are actually interacting with the stimuli. You can take pigeons and you can teach pigeons to tell you whether the schedule that they just experienced was reinforcement or extinction, right? So you expose them to a schedule, and then right after they've experienced reinforcement, you set up keys, and there's one key for which a response is reinforced if they just experienced reinforcement, and another key for which the response is reinforced if they just experienced extinction. So you can get pigeons essentially to tell you. In that way, you are making the stimuli associated with the schedule discriminative, right? SDs. The pigeons have to respond differentially to that. We could do this with the kids. So you could have the kids tell, oh, when the board is empty, does food happen? When the board is full, does, you know what I mean? Like you could set that up and essentially check to see if you get discriminative control. And if you do, well, then that's the circumstance under which I would expect the early component links have a suppressive effect on behavior, right? So I don't know. For me, I think it's important to publish findings when you get different outcomes across participants, just so that you can start talking about how do we take the ones for which we didn't get this outcome and produce it? How would we take the ones for which we got that outcome and get rid of it, right? Because fundamentally, that's where you'd like to go clinically to eliminate that sort of outcome. Mm-hmm. There's a whole line of research in terms of sussing that out and figuring out what are the circumstances under which we get this? What are the generality boundaries that we have to cross? Based on basic research and some of our findings, I don't think we need to worry about response suppression under the types of token schedules that are common. So if it's a relatively small ratio requirement, I don't think we need to worry about it.
I've seen tokens where they're like 50. Like there's
the really big
boards, right? You might have to worry about those.
Well, or I mean, think about stuff like a kid. You get these with kids that have more well-developed verbal repertoires, where they're earning like a trip at the end of the month or something like that.
Right.
And hopefully you've got things that are more immediate that they're earning along the way. But I don't know. Like sometimes those delays are too big to have any effect on behavior, and that's kind of what you're looking at. Is the delay too big? Or again, think about our experience when you're writing or you've got some big task to do, you procrastinate. You know what I mean? Like this phenomenon, this potential for early component response suppression, this phenomenon, I think, is the same phenomenon that we have when we talk about procrastination. I also think it's the same phenomenon that we talk about when we're talking about pre-ratio pauses. So just the PRPs on an FR schedule. I think we're looking at the same thing in this case. And everything that we know about those PRPs, we should be able to apply to our generation of token reinforcement systems. So again, there's got to be some utility in making them variable, I think, right? And if you could do the same sort of discrimination test, like empty token board, does reinforcement happen here? No. Full token board, yes. Well, if you make it variable, then sometimes it would be yes, right? Or when it's blank. And so there should be ways to eliminate problematic stimulus functions that are developed.
I think, Jay, some of the points you're bringing up right now, unless either of you have any other follow-ups, I feel like we'd be a good time to maybe go into maybe even do an extended dissemination station just to really get into like, what are we looking for? Like, what are the pieces of the token economies that are relevant?
Here we are.
We're not here yet. Now we're here. Now we made it to the dissemination station. So I guess, Jason, like you mentioned, depending on the ratio, we're looking at the smaller ratios. We're looking at our standard, FR, what is it? Like FR1, and it's, 10,
sure.
You get your 10, and then you exchange for your, whatever it is, your 5 minutes with the iPad, whatever it might be. You're probably not going to see that same, you might not see that same kind of like post or pre-ratio pause. You might not see the suppression of responding. But what are the signals that you would recommend practitioners look at if they are thinking, man, the kid's been doing so great with that 1 and the 10, like, let's go into the 50 tokens for the trade-in. Sure. Or if they have like an elaborate, say, point system where it is really an economy where, the different points of the different values and the various backup reinforcers, and they could be, 8 million points to get the awesome, Marlboro cigarettes jacket or whatever you used to be able to get in those old, old catalogs.
So cool.
Yeah, I don't think we can support that. But yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, no longer.
So your major measure is how much behavior per unit time are you getting? So, and again, if we can look to behavioral economics for some thoughts about this. So the work output functions tend to be bitonic. So they start low. If you had a student for whom there was like edible reinforcement on every trial of a program, well, how much of that before the kid starts to fill up? At one point, do you start getting an abolishing operation? The kid starts getting off task more, not paying attention as much, is like running around the room, finding other sources of reinforcement, right? So there are measures like per unit time, how much work you're getting done. If you thin that schedule a bit, well, now the kid's got to work more for the same amount of edibles. The kid has to be on task more. So there are potentially important DVs. Now, nobody's done a study on this, but again, if people out there need theses or dissertations, I think the most important measures would be latency to getting on task. So, hey, buddy, you can earn some tokens. How long does it take? Does the kid pop up and run to the table? Or does it take a lot of cajoling to get there? If you have, then you can look at a larger measure like the overall rate. So if you have an hour, how much work do we get done in the hour? How many trials do we get done? You could run like a local response rate. So once we start working and we've got a 10 trial session, how long does it take us to get through those 10 trials? And so that's nice because it gets rid of the consumption time, the trade-in time out of your hour. So those are all important measures. Your schedule is not optimized if it's taking too long for the kid to get this done. If you're finding yourself challenged to get the kid on task. There's an interface here with problem behavior treatment as well. So there's good evidence that we can use powerful arbitrary reinforcers in a DRA to keep the rate of problem behavior down. Well, if you're seeing the kid engaging in more problem behavior, that means that the competing schedule that you've got in place for working is not strengthening behavior enough to move it away from the contingency that's supporting the problem behavior. And so that can be sort of an auxiliary measure as well, I think. So Rob, those are some things to look out for. I think if you're finding yourself, well, I find myself clinically asking the clinicians that I work with to, when they develop a schedule, to also develop the end of it. Like in 5 years, what do you want this to look like? And then to build the steps in between. And so I'm always asking them to build dynamic reinforcement schedules for which the thinning is already part of it. I think that's helpful because I think it orients you toward what your goal is. We need to use fewer edibles. And if we can get the kids off the screens a little bit, that would be great. Like there are some reasons to thin the density of reinforcement. And you want to do that in a thoughtful fashion. So we end up like, we'll use just like a sort of word table and lay out how many steps there are to the program. And if there's 20 steps, fine. If there's 30 steps, fine. That's okay. You want to be, thoughtfully moving. And then just keep an eye on it. So if we probably always like to be thinning the density of things like edibles, for example. And keep an eye on, are we getting to a point where the kid's not paying attention anymore? Are we getting to the point where the latencies have come up, right? And latency is a pretty easy DV to get. You can just probe it a couple times during the day and plot it across conditions. So again, if anybody needs a thesis, like take a week and run with one schedule and then change the kid's schedule and then just probe the latencies. You could have people just do that on the floor in the regular educational setting. And you're just coming in and probing the latencies to the first response. One of my former students who went on and got her doctorate with Brian Jwaideh, Katie Horton, when she was at the New England Center before heading out, she oversaw one of our teams, like the groups of students, and she changed their token exchange production schedules across weeks. And she got IOA on it by having the one teacher, another teacher had the backup reinforcers. So teacher A would have to go to teacher B to get the exchange to happen, and then both could record that it had occurred. And then she just used the total amount of work done during the week. And so she could see at each schedule value, is this going up or going down, right? And you wouldn't need to do a whole week. You could do a day or something like that. But there ought to be a way in which, imagine you do one schedule value a day, and if across a 5-day week, well, you've got 5 different schedule values. If you do it the next week, that's 2 weeks, and you've replicated. That would be interesting. You might get a response output function that's bitonic that shows you what's an optimal schedule for this kid. Nobody's ever done that. And so that's not too long to do. And it might be useful to have a more empirically determined schedule to use.
I love what you said about making a long-term plan for how you as the clinician might work to fade out or thin out some of these schedules, because I think that isn't always thought about when someone, laminates that very first token board. But our goal should absolutely always be to be moving away from having additional physical stimuli in the environment such that the behavior is going to be maintained by naturally occurring stimuli. So as much as we can, make a plan to either never introduce edibles in the first place or work to systematically decrease that and move to something that's going to be a little more naturalistic, I think is important to consider. Because once that stuff's in place, there needs to be a plan for.
Yeah. Well, think about, I like including that in the IEP process also, those sorts of things, because if you think about a student who goes from one teacher to the next, to the next, to the next, right? In my experience, there's a lot of reinventing the wheel, or the old program gets scrapped and the new, and there isn't really thought being given to what is this student's progression over time. And it's a long-term thing. And so I think if we codified, here's the plan for this student, it might take a few years to get here, but this is at least the plan. And so that we all have eyes on this thing and we use it to work with together. But I think that our students benefit from that sort of experience.
Jason, I know one of the things that it sort of, popped up in my head and certainly in the paper and in talking with you tonight, you sort of talked about some ways around it. But when we're talking about using token economies, at least for some individuals where you might get that suppression of responding, did you at any point say like token economies are overrated? Why are we bothering with them so much? Like, should we just say, let's move on to something different? Or if we're not doing these assessments, we're not really
less discriminable contingencies.
Yeah. I mean, it just sort of felt like, you've got some of your participants just had the same responding, didn't seem to matter what the schedule was, whether it was change or the tandem. Some did, depending on they did have that suppression of responding depending on the ratio, and they might be ratios that you're talking about those goals that you'd like to reach at some point. Is there still like a pro to like, no, I think token economies are still worth exploring or still worth using, or are they slightly overrated? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
It's hard for me to have a value thought about the methodology. Can they be useful? Sure. Yeah, there are many examples of that. And whether it's like across many different populations, there are examples of the use of token economies that are effective. It's just there are some elements of them that I think we should pay attention to. And we'd rather not get ourselves in a position where we happen to be in a place where the token is, or the token schedule is actually hurting us. So that's sort of where I land on. If you're gonna do teaching, you got to have some event that it's going to act as a reinforcer, right? Like if the kid did it, that's right. Ideally, it's you saying that's right, and that as long as that works, that's great. Why add more to that? But there can be reasons to have a reinforcement system that allows you to leverage reinforcers that you can't deliver all the time. So if you imagine you're working with a kid for whom the most powerful reinforcers are things like going to the mall or something like that. Well, I can't do going to the mall contingent on each instance of the behavior that I'm interested in. And so the use, right. So the use of some type of token system allows me to take the efficacy of going to the mall and use it on a more regular basis to try to increase the likelihood of responding. Or, there are ways to include response cost contingencies, or there are options that you have with the token economy that are hard to enact when you're talking about a larger down the road sort of event that takes place. So that I think is certainly a useful aspect of them. I just was working on some clinical programming for a student last week and trying to figure out, he had like a 1 month sort of like DRO thing set up. That's big, and he's got a good verbal repertoire, and there might be verbal stimuli that we can use for that sort of thing. But I ended up having them break that into much smaller units so that there were essentially like elements delivered each day toward the 30-day thing. Well, that from my perspective is nicer, because then you can say, okay, so as long as like, you're safe today and you take your meds and you take a shower, like there's some like really important things that we need you to not miss. As long as those things are happening, you're getting your ticket toward this terminal thing. You know what I mean? So, and that way I can do that on a day by day. And if we miss a day, it's fine. It doesn't like kick us back a whole 30 days. We can just start again tomorrow and it's fine. And so it gives you the ability to operate a schedule at a more molecular unit of analysis, and sometimes that can be pretty helpful. So ultimately, they're the use of condition reinforcers. They're ubiquitous anyway. I mean, they're out there. We've run into them all the time, so it's worth studying them. The question is, do we have to contrive them? And how Diana was making this point, if we're going to contrive them, what are the steps toward getting them back out or getting control by the stimuli that are in the environment that we would like to be exerting control? So I don't know if that helps. I think that the major, with regard to a concern about tokens being worse than not having them, the thing to think about is, am I seeing long latencies to getting started? Am I seeing the kid really off task? Well, that's indicative of the schedule not operating the way that you want, and you might then have to make some modifications to the way that you've got it set up.
That's good. Any other kind of ideas, whether they're ideas that are out in the research or that you think, hey, we need some future research on that? You mentioned a number, I think, throughout the episode, but just, for folks who, kind of want to get those last points sort of condensed for them. I think we talked like the VR token economies, but like any thoughts like that you'd either want research or you say, I'd love to see people trying this out, or I think this would be a more beneficial way to run those token economies to avoid some of these potential pitfalls?
Here's what strikes me, and I can give you some insight into a little bit of, what my lab's working on and what we're trying to figure out. We had a discussion about what's the right schedule. Is there an optimal schedule? Because again, not all unit prices are the same. And so one of my doctoral students right now is assessing the use of concurrent progressive ratio schedules to identify pricing for the items that are in a menu-based economy. So it's very common for when people develop these menus, like smaller stuff, usually they make cheaper, bigger things, they make more expensive. And so there's this idea that there's an equating of the unit prices across these things. So that's kind of the idea. But normally when we do that, we guess. And then we see if our client is buying the same thing all the time, we can say, okay, well, that unit price is too small. We should tinker with it.
Yeah.
And so one of my students essentially is setting up a series of concurrent PRs so that you start and here are all the reinforcers. Everything costs 1. Which one do you want? And then the kid picks one, and then that one now costs 2. All the other ones stay at 1. Which one do you want? The kid picks that one again. Well, now it costs 4. All the other ones stay at 1. And so the idea is the kid picks that one until there's a switch.
Yeah.
Right. Well, now you know the price of that in comparison to the others. And so we can run that and let the kid pick until everything has been picked at least once. And that should give you an estimation of the relative unit prices so that they're generally equated.
Wow.
Right?
There's finally utility of the multiple stimulus with replacement.
That's right.
Wow. That's actually very clever.
I love that. I love that idea.
Yeah.
So if we think thematically, the preference assessments are pretty easy. And you can do them, like think about the multiple stimulus, whatever, like a one trial multiple stimulus is useful. Just here's a bunch of stuff, kid, pick one. Great, let's use that. That's useful. It's efficient. It's really easy to do. It's easy to teach someone to do that. I would love us to have better methodology for the titrating of the values, the components of our token schedule so that we can empirically identify them instead of just guessing at what they are. And I haven't thought of super efficient ways, like a bunch of PRs. That's kind of tricky, you can do it, but it's a little tricky to run concurrent PRs like that. We've talked about, one of my students is proposing, see if I can do this pretty quickly. So that in behavioral economics, the work function or the response output function again is bitonic. So it starts low. As the price increases, the rate of responding comes up, and then it reaches a peak, and then it starts to drop. And so that area where it starts to drop is when, in a molecular sense, extinction is starting to happen. So that you've got responding, and then the response starts to slow. And so that's, again, people call it ratio strain, but in a molecular sense, that's the beginning of extinction taking place. So, all right, well, the sweet spot there is at the peak of the curve. So people will call that price Pmax. That's the price at which there's the maximal likelihood of behavior. So that's kind of like what your target is, right? So theoretically, what you might be able to do is start by reinforcing a response on an FR1 and then switch to extinction. And then you check to see you're measuring the inner response times. So the time between each response and just counting them. How many responses is it? First response, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth into extinction. And at some point, the inner response time is going to start to increase. Well, why is that increasing? The inner response time is increasing because that's when extinction is starting to take place. This is your subject, your participant experiencing ratio strain at that point. Well, that's going to, if you flip that over, that's your response output function. So you should be able to, essentially in one trial, like a little 5-minute sit down, figure out how many responses does it take for this kid's inner response time to start to grow. And then you go like one back from that. So if we start seeing the inner response time come up at response 10, cool, we'll use 9. If we see it come up at response 20, well, that means we can go farther. If we see it doesn't come up until response 40, great, I can go way further out with my schedule. So it's a molecular way to speak to the same sort of phenomenon that we see at play in these unit price experiments. That would be pretty efficient. And that's a way to, like we had talked about before, at what point do I increase the schedule value? Well, that's a way to test to see at what point do you need to increase the schedule value. In fact, you can do the same study and use the tokens, like use praise, use whatever your condition reinforcer is, and you keep doing it, but you take the primary reinforcer out. And then you're just saying, how long can I keep doing the condition reinforcer before the IRT starts to come up? Mm-hmm. Well, that would tell you how much behavior you can sustain with the condition reinforcer before you need a primary reinforcer, right? So that's a way to empirically determine the exchange production schedule, I think.
You've given everyone so many great ideas for their theses.
I know.
And their dissertations. I was going to say, is that why research demonstrates that the 30-hour work week is basically just as productive as the 40-hour work week?
Like Friday afternoon, how much am I doing?
We have a 2-hour really important faculty meeting once a month from 2 to 4. It's like the
on
worst
Fridays.
time.
Ooh.
Yeah, I don't know. That's
you max out, right?
You max out.
Yeah.
You P-max. That's what I'm going to call now. Man, I'm P-max.
Yep, I am P-max.
Well, you probably have a daily one like that too. I do.
Yep.
I try to get up early to do my editing because if I do it late at night, it takes me forever to do anything and I can't concentrate,
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
My best time of day is when I'm supposed to be driving everyone around to different activities and cooking dinner. That's my most productive time, and I can't use it well.
No.
That's tricky.
I try to help, but I'm apparently not doing very much, Jason. Sorry. I just didn't know.
Well, you bring your laptop to the game and you set up on the side. And
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Stuff done.
I'm always sad when soccer season is over because I'm like, oh, but that's when I was going to read those articles. Oh,
That's funny.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming on tonight, giving us so much to think about with token economies, giving us, a lot of background information, a lot of future information. I always, love taking something that I've just taken for granted for a long, long time, and then actually getting a chance to talk about what's really going on with these schedules and with these, this type of condition reinforcer. So thank you for that. If folks want to contact you or email you with any questions about the research or about any of kind of your ideas on schedules and on token economies, where can they reach you?
Yeah, so my email address is jbourret, Bourret, @necc.org.
Thank you so much to Dr. Jason Bourret for coming on the show, talking to us all about condition reinforcers, token economies, what the future holds. And for many of you, you might have some great new thesis ideas out there. I think Jason was sort of just dropping thesis ideas like they were going out of style. It was amazing, amazing stuff. It was really nice to have him on the show tonight. And before we wrap up, I want to give you that last code word, and that's Bailey, B-A-I-L-E-Y. Again, another important name in behavior analysis, or perhaps you're thinking of something else like, I was going to say Bailey Leafs, but that's not really a thing. Not really a thing, or Baileys, that liqueur. But no, it's none of those things. It's Bailey, B-A-I-L-E-Y. Thanks one more time to Dr. Jason Bourret for being on our show. Thanks to Jackie and Diana. And thank you for listening. We'd love it if you subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to get your podcasts. We'd love it if you leave a review. And hey, why not check out some of the other places we are online? We're as ABA Inside Track on all the social medias. We're on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can get all of these episodes. You can find our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can get links to all of the articles discussed in this episode, as well as to all of our previous episodes, and of course, purchase CEs. And if you want even more ABA Inside Track content every month, you can go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for $5 a month, you can get all of our episodes a week ahead of time, as well as access to our special live episodes and Q&A recordings. And if you're so inclined, why not check out our premium tier, where for $10 a month, you can get access to our extra long or 2-hour-long book club podcast. We just finished and should have just posted a preview for our Look Me in the Eye book club, where we discussed the memoir of the author John Elder Robison, who was an adult who was not diagnosed with, at the time, Asperger's syndrome until he was in his 40s, and what his life growing up was like. We also have some other books on, say, neurotribes, meaningful differences, and the other end of the leash. So we run the whole gamut. So please check us out there, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Finally, some big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his excellent editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!